Good morning. Uh, this is the Dr. Obutashaka Show. I'm Obutashaka. Uh, this is one of the special shows. This is part two of the show that we had last week. And the topic for this morning is self-knowledge, is knowing God within us. Self-knowledge is knowing God within us. The first show was dealing with African or Black humanism and providing models for just societies. And so we're taking a deeper dive into an aspect of African perspectives and philosophies and deep thought, and African American perspectives and philosophies and deep thought, and some perspectives coming out of a special branch of knowledge called parapsychology, which is the branch of gifted spiritual people who have had various kinds of experiences, and some who just have had life after death experiences. And what's interesting is for virtually all of these conform to what Africans have seen and African Americans have seen about this spirit realm. And I should say we're going to draw quite a bit today on Kemetic or Egyptian deep thought about the spirit realm. And their deep thought conforms to what we know from experience. And you're going to see some of the things that we talk about today. You will see that you've experienced some of this in your own life. So this is not speculation, though some people will think it is. And this is not religion. This is spirituality, what you call spirituality, but which is actually the realm of the spirit, which is the realm of God. So self-knowledge is knowing God within us. And there's some assumptions there that we'll talk about as well. In the last show, I was looking at humanism in the context of Black African people, but this context applies to all humanity, but it's a perspective that we have. And I focused heavily on how de-spiritualization, or the European project to take spirit out of everything, was really the greatest roadblock to us being able to save the planet. And I ranked it along with capitalism and racism as real roadblocks to humanism, or expressing ideas about humanity or being human. So I'm going to continue that a little bit, but today is going to focus on a particular aspect of the power that human beings draw from, that comes from God. And of course, when we talk about self-knowledge as knowing God within us, self-knowledge includes many areas. And so self-knowledge of self ethnically, that has to do with ethnic self-knowledge. That is, our knowledge of ourselves as Black and African people. This show is grounded in what's called the sixfold stages to mental freedom, where Bulanlela Wabogo and I have actually been able to trace the stages we go through when we're waking up. So that's one level of self-knowledge. And we're going to spend considerable time in subsequent shows on how we can track where we are in terms of our awakening. We now have this thing called woke. And for those of us whose eyes are opening, where are we on this path? But then as we recognize the path, then we want to talk about how can we dig deeper and gain a deeper knowledge of ourselves so that we can really express and feel the deepest sense of self-love. You can't love anybody else if you don't love yourself. And this is really the key to your whole life. So that's another level of self-knowledge. But here we're dealing with the spirit level. And of course, this is the essence of what it is to be human. And because humanism, or what it is to be human, is so complex, the human being is so complex, I'm not going to try and do some comprehensive stuff on that. So what I want to focus on is that realm of spirit. You see behind me um, these pneumo twins that I had on the previous show. These are Dogon symbols of principles in Dogon philosophy embodied by what they call pneumo, N-U-M-M-O, or N-O-M-M-O, twins. And that means word twins. And it's the central principle in Dogon philosophy at the level of Jiriso and Beniso, which is Jiriso, forward, simple stuff you see in front of you, and Beniso, sideward, more complex, but you see it through peripheral vision. And so that they represent fundamental principle of how we view the cosmos. In European thought, it's good or bad. It's either or. It's one on the top, one on the bottom, hierarchy. But in African thought, good is bad. That's African American, by the way. Disorder is order. Life is slow dying. These are principles that are really principles of life. And if we're to undergo transformation, it's really understanding and internalizing those principles. It took me years to remove this absolute mind thought of either or, good or bad, it's either one or the other, to understand that the cosmos, nature, and humanity um, operates on twinness, not opposites, meaning good on this earth plane contains some things that aren't good. Positive contains negative. The masculine, which these two symbols represent, contains the feminine. And that is the essence of being human, is to be able to work out a synthesis between the two of those. So that's behind you because it's reflective of African deep thought, which the Dogon called deep knowledge. My former teacher, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, called deep thought. Um, and it's also called philosophy. That's a term, but for African philosophy, it's different from Western philosophy in that spirit is at the core of it. And what you see that these two twins are sitting on is a Akan symbol. The Akan people are from Ghana, or the Asante people. And it's a symbol, Geonami. Um, and what it means is no one but God, or except God. It means that God was before everything else. It also means that God is in everything else. So I have those two here to remind people that we're going deep and we're drawing from a deep well. And that deep well is our culture, both African and New African or African American. Now, the purpose of this show is to really examine what does it mean to be human, um, with a special emphasis on spirit. In discussing what it means to be human, uh, we also have to deal with the obstacles to expressing that, because we have lived in a world of great inhumanity, of great oppression. We've come through some terrible experiences, one of which was enslavement. Native Americans, it was extermination. Um, and many people in this country, it's just systemic oppression. So if we're to understand what it means to be human, we also need to understand the basis for the inhumanity that we have faced, that we are fighting, not only to overcome as systems, but to also see that we don't fall into that same pit. And I must say that African people throughout the Western Hemisphere who experienced enslavement um, have demonstrated high levels of humanity. So do not assume that we need to be saved, or that you need to get some lecture from me on how to be human. It's in us. In fact, I say, I've said this before, I don't repeat myself too much, but if Black people lost, and I'm talking African people all over the world, if we lost 90% of our humanity, we'd still, that 10% would be more than most people have. So kindness and truthfulness and these kind of things are in us. So I'm not here to save people and tell people how to be kind. You know what I mean? Your mama's told you that. And if you weren't listening, sooner or later, hopefully you did, or you will. But I think most of us do. But what we need to do is understand the origin of this inhumanity that we faced. We also not only need to understand its source, because it's underneath what oppresses us, but some of us are departing into this realm now more than at any time before. And some of us don't even know what we're departing into, because, as I pointed out before, one of the failures of our scholars is that most have not studied the European mind. We studied white racism, and that's important, but I'm not discarding it. You don't see me mainly focusing on that because it's something we know. I like to go into stuff we don't know. We think we know the European, but if you have not studied his mind, he spent a lot of time, he thinks, studying yours, but you see, he studied his image of your mind. He doesn't know your mind. And we always say we know his. Yeah, we know the racist, barbaric behavior. We know that. And we know there's some whites that aren't like that. We know that. But we haven't really studied their so-called philosophy of life, which was with them before they ever came in contact with us, and shapes how they not only treat us and see the world, but how they treat their own people. So in order for us to see the God that is within us, we need to also be clear about the obstacles that are in our way. Obstacles that African American culture, which was created by field Blacks in this country, have provided a pathway to overcome. So we normally consider the people who run this system and run Europe and have been running the world for 500 years and are now in decline. Europe has fallen, America's in decline and undergoing falling. And part of the reason for us examining this is we need to be thinking about our future. What kind of world do we want our children to live in? We need to be thinking of an alternative to this mess. And so we need to understand the mind of those who have created this system that has brought so much misery to the planet. We often call the people that have been oppressing us Europeans. But that's an incorrect term. We need to define them as they have defined themselves. See them through their eyes. My master teacher, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, introduced me to this area. So I always like to give credit where credit is due. And he was one of the great giants and masters among our people. And his best work is a book called Medu Neter. You should read it. It's a picture of him. A little short, humble, tough brother. I'd enjoy calling Jake and saying, Jake, what should I read? Or just listening to Jake, you know, a real pleasure. He passed on to the ancestral realm. So he's the one that really got me to begin to take a deeper look at this. I'm a warrior, so knowing my enemy is important, and I study their philosophy and stuff, but he got me to look at this from another perspective. So Jake, up there in heaven, giving you credit for launching me on this path right here. So what we need to understand is what we call the European, that's a recent invention that comes after the fall of the Roman Empire. It takes them a while to come up with a conception that you call Europe, but there's never really been a Europe because it's always been divided states. So it's a state of mind, this idea of Europe. But what did they call themselves before that? They called themselves Aryans. Aryans included Persians, who are now in Iran and are Muslims, but in ancient times were not. It includes Indo-Aryans. These are the Aryans of India. They call themselves Indo-Aryans, but you'll see a lot of them are brown skinned, and that's because they came in as conquerors, as nomads, without women. And so they had sex with the African women, and that created a more browning, though you have white Aryans. And they create the real first systems of racial oppression on the planet. A lot of people say racism comes out of capitalism. That's a Marxist analysis. It actually begins among the Indo-Aryans, and they create what's called a notion of caste. The people who ran India were Dravidians. They now call themselves Dalits, Black people. And these Black people had a caste system, but their caste system was a caste system that you find in parts of Africa that was occupational. So if your father or mother, particularly your father, had a certain profession, you followed it, but not always. But what these Aryans did is they came in and took this system and renamed it. And they called caste Varna, and Varna means color. And they put on the bottom of this system the people who had run the country before, the Dravidians. And they were put in a category below slavery called untouchability. I mean, what kind of mind can conceive of something below slavery? So the Indo-Aryans, a couple of thousand years ago, invade India, and they take over a caste system. And they also take over a lot of their spirit systems, but they inject their own views into it. And one of which is hate, grounded in a caste system based on color. So that's another Aryan group. And then you have the Aryans of Greece. And these are the people who are generally considered to be the fathers of Western civilization, but as we know, heavily influenced by Kemetic or Egyptian thought and culture. And Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, above all, acknowledged it. He was an initiate in the Kemetic mystery system for over 20 years and was the greatest influence on Plato. Next to Plato, influence, the next most influential person was Socrates. Yet while the Greeks drew from Kemet, they were fundamentally Aryans. And their view of the world is pretty much the view that Westerners have today. Another group of Aryans are the people called Slavic, which is the term for slave. They were the first among the Aryans to be enslaved. They're the largest group of Aryans. And you don't hear much of them because the Western Aryans, the European Aryans, don't like them. And, they look down on them. But the point is, these are all the people called Aryans that Western and Eastern Europeans are descended from. And I'm going into this root because it's the root of a thing that tells you the most about it. You may not know it, but your roots are in Africa. I know most of you that watch this show do, but a lot of our people don't. The old saying that we have, you can take us out of Africa, but you can't take the African out of us. We don't know how true that is because the things that Black people like the most are African, starting with Black women or Black men. But our tastes are more African than we know. We like a say-so in everything. It's ingrained in us. The last time I talked about cellular memory. We know about genetic memory. Some of this is ingrained, but it's in our culture, So when you go into the roots of something, you're getting into what you really are. And so when we go into the roots of the European, which is Aryan, then we're going into the essence of their being. And so while they take on other things, for example, Christianity is not a Western religion. It's Hebrew, it's Judaic, and it has its roots in the mystery system of Kemet, as do Islam and Judaism itself. But these all depart also. They have many things in common, but they depart. And so when you get a lot of whites quoting Jesus or quoting the Bible and stuff like that, some of them may really believe it. But underneath it lurks this Aryan, because that's the fundamental white person. And that's why in slavery, the worst slave master was the best Christian slave master. He's the one, he might not whip you on Sunday, but every other day, he did everything possible that was horrible to you. So the veneer in the Western world for whites is Christianity. And for some of them, it's real. But it's very hard, as you're going to see when we look at what does it mean to be Aryan, for them to particularly adopt this New Testament, this Jesus, this loving, kind person, this rebel against oppression. That's a hard one because that's going against their self-knowledge. It's going against their sense of who they are. So we need to understand, and this often when people talk about Aryans, they only just talk about the general group Aryan, but there are two divisions within the Aryans, and you're going to see that that applies to today as well. One is Arius, A-R-Y-A, or in the plural, A-R-Y-A-S, Arius. And then there's Aryans. The Arius refers to the leaders of the masses who are called Aryans. The leaders, as we know, and this is generally true of what you now call European, but Aryan history, their leaders were warriors, largely. The ones that came into India, the Greeks, the Romans, warriors. And they ruled over the Aryan masses. And it's very important to understand the relationship of the rulers to the ruled, because that really tells you their fundamental view of peoplehood, of humanity. And it's only after that shape do they interact with the outside world, including Black people. And so what you see as horrendous behavior towards us, it begins in their treatment of their own people. So this is a show talking about humanism and knowing the God within. And then right now I'm dealing with, well, the obstacles that some of us may have to even putting forward some comprehensive definitions of what humanism means or explaining it. Though I'd say most Black people don't have trouble with that because it's ingrained in your culture. It's in your DNA. It's in your cellular memory. You know what I mean? But still, we're living in a world that says one thing and does another. We call it hypocrisy. It really isn't. You're just believing what they're saying. They don't mean it. That's what you need to understand. They don't mean it. That's not all of them. Some of them mean well. I always liked the type like John Brown, you know, he meant well. He put his life on the line for freedom. Now that is a good white man, you know what I mean, who stands for his principles. So what is the Arius's view of their people? And by the way, this is connected to their view of morality, because we're a very moral people. Even some of us who've fallen off the track, we know that we're wrong. You know what I mean? That's ingrained in us. So this is their view of their people also says a lot about not only their view of themselves, but their view of ethics, morals, what's called right. So it's key to understand that the Arius, the rulers, viewed their people. And if you think about the bad condition that whites have lived under the rule of their own people all over the world, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Because we're always looking at, yeah, free white and 21, whites get privileges here. They get to step on us to come in. But then what kind of privileges do they get when they get here? You understand? Why is it that the founding fathers of this country owned half the wealth? Why was there a Shays Rebellion when these War of Independence fighters came back and their property was being taken because they couldn't pay taxes? Of course they couldn't. They were fighting in the War of Independence. So the rich who weren't fighting was going to grab what they had. The Constitutional Convention was formed to stop them from getting it back, and particularly from, as Madison said, equitably distributing the wealth and not paying their usurious debts. Why was that? Because even when they fought in the War of Independence, they had no shoes, often barely had clothes, while the officers ate well, dressed well, and got paid after the war. These guys couldn't even hold on to the property they had, and most of them didn't have anything. This state of being, in which now over 140 million people in this country live in poverty, more of us percentage-wise than any other group, but a large number of whites. This arises from their root view of their people, of the masses. And so what did the Arians think about their people? The grassroots, the everyday white people. They said they were bad, dirty, good for nothing people. I'm going to tell you that the owner of Amazon has that same idea. Of course, he got slick and now he's going to pay his workers $15 an hour. He owns more than most of the planet. That's his means to try and stop unionization. Unionize that place. You hear me? Unionize it and get yourself $50 an hour. And Jeff Bezos still be rich. Next thing is tax them. Put them back in that 90% tax bracket that Roosevelt had. But the point is, someone who would steal the tips from his workers would also have to share this view of bad, dirty, good for nothing people. You hear me? So the word Arius in the Slavic and Iranian and Western European languages meant powerful. The commanders and the rich. You hear me? So these Arius rulers, of all their possessions, in addition to power and wealth, their most important possession was the truth of power. The truth of power. That is, how do you wield it? Want to deal with a later version of it? It's Machiavelli, you know what I mean? How to grab power and manipulate people. It is the knowledge of power. But power is the aphrodisiac of Western man. Why do a lot of people want to be president? It's the power, baby. Corporate heads have even more. If you look at university presidents, where I worked for 40 years, those presidents have the same idea. They are in charge. One of the presidents at San Francisco State that I fought and whipped, his greatest pleasure was terrorizing his deans, PhDs running colleges. A lot of them could run their colleges better than he could run the campus. Not that he wasn't bad. He was a good builder, this particular president. But he gained pleasure out of terrorizing his subordinates and firing them at will for no reason. Because this is the other thing about the Aryan. Their notion of power derives from the Greek world's first philosopher, Hesiod, who was an illiterate poet, sheepherder, whose views reflected the fundamental views of the Aryan. And the fundamental view of Hesiod in his Theogony, where he talks about the gods, is the arbitrary power that gods expressed. But that was the ethos of the Greeks. They were at war with each other. Why? City-state against each other. Power. Why? Arbitrary. There wasn't any good reason. One decided to take it from the other. This is at the heart of the Aryan view. And it is a power exercised by the rich, by those on top. So the contempt that the Arius rulers had for their own people was then also transferred to strangers and eventually to Black people. And over time, this emerges into racism. And so while the masses of Aryans are viewed in contempt, when racism emerges, we're put in a category below human. And even the contemptible, so-called contemptible masses join in this oppression. And this is, of course, the case with whites in America. And it was Lyndon Johnson, I think, who said that, I know he said it, I can't say exactly how he said it. He said it quite well. He said, the easiest way to pick a white man's pocket is just use that N-word. And use that, and you can get anything from him. Like his common sense. Like, I don't want that Obamacare, you know what I mean? But I want that affordable care. You get stupid, you know what I mean? So there's a relationship between the way in which the Aryans were viewed by their Arius masters and by how they both came to view the other, the stranger, and particularly the Blacks, because the Blacks had something they wanted, land, and in some cases, knowledge. And so this inhumanity was a good part of that. Now, this Aryan view of the contemptible masses and this view of arbitrary power made it very difficult for them to entertain the notion of God dwelling inside of you. Some of them had some spirit practices, they had some sorcery, and women were the major architects of that. And a lot of work went into dethroning European women, Aryan women, from their power, burning them as witches and stuff like that. But this contemptible view of humanity would create contemptible conditions. If your view of humanity is so low, what kind of society do you create? You, of course, create misery. You create poverty. You create jails. Because this idea that God dwells within each of us, all the societies that had that view, African societies in particular, had no prisons. And only with the coming of Islam and Christianity and the change of the elite mindset does this seep in. Because if God dwells inside of you, how could you think of imprisoning God? You hear me? It's cruel. I don't like to go to a zoo to see animals caged up because they're free. And they also have God's spirit within them. They're here for different purposes. They're a part of that balance. But caging them, pure torture, you know, pure torture. So if you got a wretched view of your own people, you will create a wretched society. And last week, I was talking about how Descartes took separated mind from spirit from body. And so you have a broken conception of a person. And so you're going to have broken societies, at least for the masses. It's going to be heaven for the rich. So when we refer to Europeans, their proper name should be Aryans, because we should define them by how they define themselves. And the best way to get this is through their linguistics. By the way, we often associate Aryan with Hitler, you know, because he decided to use the Aryan name for the definition of the European, and then symbols that he claimed to be Aryan, the swastika, which actually, you know, you have swastikas in Africa, have nothing to do with what Hitler is talking about. But what we don't know about Hitler, most of us do not know this. The model for Aryanism in Germany was not the Indo-Aryan that invaded India. It was not the Greeks. It was not the Romans. It was the Americans. Hitler modeled Nazi Germany after America because he was on the project of exterminating Jews, exterminating Gypsies, exterminating anybody that he was opposed to. And what society was the master of genocide? The United States of America. This is documented. He was into eugenics, which was, you know, this idea that if someone has some kind of flaw in them of any kind, you should be able to either perform lobotomies on them or kill them. And America was the master of eugenics. And we know this started on the plantation where Black women and men were operated on without even anesthetics. You understand? And of course, genocide, the Native American. This is a society founded on genocide and then enslavement, because Hitler was about using the labor of conquered people, particularly Slavic people, who he considered them to be inferior, to man his war machine and to work them to death. And the financiers of Hitler heavily came from the United States, not just Henry Ford, but a whole group of other rich whites. And in fact, in the 30s, these rich whites favored Hitler over Roosevelt because they were dictators themselves. And as long as that dictator would not take their money away from them and keep people working and working at slave wages, fine for them, you know? So if you think this term Aryan is in the past, you're mistaken. So when we talk about the term European, we should call them by their own self-definition, Aryans. Now, the Aryans' miserable view of their own people, who were stripped of spirituality, in part derived from their view of the world. And their view of the world was that useful is what's important, not morals, what's useful. So if you enslave somebody, that's all right. In fact, it's good because it serves your needs. So one thing about the European mind is that it's very much into usefulness, or what in philosophy is called utilitarianism. And what it means is, instead of being moral, what is good for them is what is useful. So slavery for you is bad. For them, it's good because it's useful. So even the terms good and bad in the Aryan vocabulary have a whole different meaning. So in the field of etymology, the best way to really understand how they think is to go into this field which deals with the root meaning of words. And by the way, Malcolm was a master of words. He really loved this. But of course, linguistics is a whole field in and of itself, but within it is a field called etymology, which is origin of words. And one of the things to understand about the Greeks, one reason why they were constantly at war with each other and everything else, and even though some of their best philosophers had been trained in Kemet, Pythagoras first among them, Plato, was that while trained in Kemet, they could never get this thing called ma'at, or truth, straight. Why? Even though they tried. Socrates tried. Talk about him in a minute. Why? Because in the Greek language, there's no word for right or ought. Right or ought. You hear me? And you can't really get what ma'at means unless you deal with truth and right. Behaving righteously. Knowing and pursuing the truth. Now, a few tried. Socrates tried. And as a result, he was sentenced to death. They gave him hemlock. They told him to drink it. Why? They said he was corrupting the youth of Greece. What was corruptible? Teaching them to look first after your soul, meaning look after your character. He was taking a foreign idea and it was being rejected. And their best philosopher at that time was forced to take hemlock. And he took it. And by the way, he could have escaped and didn't. And I always say, I think because at heart and soul, he was Greek. And even though he was trying to teach the value of truth, in the end, as a Greek man or a Greek woman, he believed in submitting to power. And so he submitted to that arbitrary power when he could have escaped. But he was trying to do something noble. Now, the word bad in the Greek language is melos. It's one of the words for bad. It meant cowardly, low, common man. That was the term described for the average, everyday Greek man or woman. Cowardly. The Greeks engaged in war all the time. And the masses of Greeks fought, not just the elite. And if a city won against another city, it was because, among other things, they had more power. So how is it that the everyday person that fought was cowardly when he was doing most of the fighting? You know? This is a view that doesn't conform to reality. And of course, lowest on the scale of Greek society and Aryan society in general is, guess who? Woman. Because if power is the basis for what's good, then of course women are viewed to be less powerful physically, yet they are the source of life. And there was a time in Greek society where among a people called the Pelagians, women held a high position. But as the Aryans come in and displace them, woman is put in the contemptible position. We Africans have a saying, you measure the level of a people by the level of your women. It appears that the Aryan measured their power by their ability to oppress their people, most especially their women. So in the Indo-Aryan European languages, good is defined not by right or wrong. Good is defined by hierarchy. Those on the top are good. Those on the bottom are bad. And be careful. Some of us take on these ideals. Shock O'Neal, nice brother. I like Shock. He don't support Trump because Trump can reduce his taxes. I mean, I don't know how much money he's got, but he's got hundreds of millions. The guy's got a ED, a PhD in education. He's not a dummy. And he's investing in all kinds of stuff. But he's going to place some money ahead of his people. Be careful with that. You're descending into another mindset. Your mama, that little woman that comes on your show, and you bow down and say, yes, mama, she didn't teach you that. So strong in the Aryan mind, particularly the Arius, strong is good, weak is bad. Be careful, some of us are taking on this attitude. Most of us don't. So the rulers in the Aryan world to this day, in that time, they were the men of strife, they were warriors. And this time it's the corporate heads who rule the warriors. They tell me when corporate heads go into the Pentagon, these 4-star generals go meek because they are their servants. And they're all, when they retire, seeking to get on one of those boards so that they can make some big money. And as General Smedley Butler said, who was a 3-star Marine Corps general, 2-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner, he said he was a gangster for these banks. He said that, So good are those with power. And I'm sick and tired of hearing presidents, and this president, he's the first one that I've heard this. God bless our troops. Why? They call it the Defense Department. They should call it the War Department. What are our troops doing? And I'm not putting the troops down as much as I am the people who put them in that position. They're laying waste in different parts of the world and losing everywhere too. You know what I mean? Huh? God bless our troops. And then God bless America. Remember what Jeremiah Wright said about that? Hillary didn't get that speech until it was too late. Barack Obama wouldn't be in the White House if good old white America had heard that. And he wasn't cursing. He was saying that America is being damned for its wrongdoing. He put God in front of it, but it wasn't a curse. He was just simply making a statement. In other words, God bless America for what? Genocide, slavery, racism, all this greed. So in the Aryan world, those who have the power are good. Those who don't are bad. Their leaders were considered to be nobles. Nobility, you're seeing this whole issue with Meghan Markle and the Queen. Now, Queen ain't got no power now. She got money and no power. You know what I mean? The Parliament has power, but more important, the British don't have any power. The sun is set on Britain that it's foggy all the time. You know what I mean? I mean, real foggy. They used to say the sun didn't set on the British Empire because when it was dark in Britain, which it too often is, the sun was rising in India or Africa because they had power there. They ain't got it anymore. So their idea of nobility was the one who was able to benefit from the armies that had conquered the world. It wasn't nobility of character. But in Africa, ancient and traditional times, and in the village of Africa today, the leaders, whether men or women, are the best men or best women, meaning the ones of highest moral character. I stayed with the family in Uganda, from Uganda in Britain, in Manchester, years ago. And this brother was from Uganda. And he was describing how in Uganda, the man who was in charge of the treasury in Uganda was a thief. But in his village, where he held the same position, he was honest. Because in the village, he was conforming to the African view of leadership, which is you're a servant and shepherd of the people. And if he stole in the village, he was stealing from his own mother. But in that parliament up there, there was a monstrosity dropped into Africa from Europe. He saw this as just a chance to get rich and wasn't looking at the fact that he was impoverishing his people. So our idea of nobility has got to do with character, not power, not power. So going back to the linguistic analysis of etymology of what it means, what good or means, and what the view of the common people was, in the German language, you have the word Schleck, S-C-H-L-E-C-K. It means bad. And it refers to the plain and simple common man. That's the view of the rulers of the ruled. Another word for bad in Greek is kakos. It means, again, common man, bad, ugly, ill-born, and mean. Now, some of this may be true. If you're hungry, you get mean. You know what I mean? And it may not be that you're ugly, but you might be dirty. You know what I mean? Because you're ground into the dust. Another term they had was deilos, D-E-I-L-O-S, meaning cowardly, wretched, low, and vile. The Greek nobility was defined linguistically by the word agathos, that meant good, well-born, gentle, capable, and brave. Now, all of this is something that is given to them because they have the title, they have the power. It's kind of like Trump, you know what I mean? He had the power. I mean, as one of his cabinet members said, he was the most flawed human being he ever saw, but everybody's running to kiss his behind. You know what I mean? It had nothing to do with no nobility of character. The man couldn't even spell it. In Latin, the word for common people, macus, M-A-C-U-S, is bad. So when we're looking at de-spiritualization, when you take the spirit and separate it from the mind, now it's only an intellectual enterprise because we're all a spirit. I don't care what your ethnicity is. But if you believe that the only thing that matters is the mind and spirit isn't anywhere in it, and if you believe that the earth is despiritualized, then what does that do? It sets you on a course for power and control. It puts you in a position where you're dealing with greed as a dominating appetite. And by the way, of all the vices, greed is the worst, because when you get consumed by greed, you'll do anything. I said this before, greed is like an entity. It possesses you. And you're never satisfied with what you have. You want more. And that's the fundamental reason why the rich are getting richer in this country and the poor are getting poorer, and blacks and brown people are on the bottom, along with Native Americans on the rock bottom. That's why. So de-spiritualization is a key component of this drive for power, because you're operating on the lower mind, in the mind of hatred and the mind of greed. So what we've seen is with this Aryan project, you have had Descartes, who separates the mind from the body, Freud, who wants to eliminate spirit from psychotherapy, Francis Bacon, who is the author of empirical science, that is observing nature. For what? For the purpose of control. And America. America is ruled by the philosophy of pragmatism, founded by a man named Pierce. What is the essence of pragmatism? It's an industrial and now post-industrial philosophy, best described by Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had fought in the Civil War and was a racist, but more important, an elitist, and held nothing but contempt for the masses of people. He said, the decisions of the Supreme Court are based on the most powerful forces in society. Later, he said he was sorry he said that because it sounded like a man called Nietzsche. Some of you may have heard of him, the author of a doctrine called the will to power. But what he was telling you was the truth. The Supreme Court rules in favor of those in power. Right now, it's been set up to rule against any remaining rights that we have to vote, and particularly to sanction all these decisions that are being made by state houses across the country to strip Blacks of the right to vote, because they had stole a lot of votes in Georgia. They stole a lot of votes around the country, but we simply outsmarted them, outvoted them, outorganized them. So now, they're trying to eliminate every measure of voting that they figure favors Blacks. And the Supreme Court is set up to do that. And unless Biden ends the filibuster and rams through some good voting rights legislation, some of which has been passed in the House already, then Democrats ain't going to see the White House for a long time. And there's a good chance they might not see the House after from 2 years from now, because they lost a lot of seats this time. So the point is that this Aryan view rules supreme in this country, with racism being at its core. And it's a contemptible view of both the masses of whites, but an even more contemptible view of the masses of Blacks, red and brown people, and yellow people that drive this attack on Asian Americans, behind Trump talking about Gung flu and the Chinese flu, and these people going up there and beating up on Asian American people. The flu ain't got nothing to do with ethnicity. The flu, smarter than Trump, it doesn't discriminate. It's equal opportunity. It'll infect whatever it can infect. And so even the virus gets into this. It gets politicized. And we got Blacks talking about they ain't taking a shot. I understand why. Because of the way they've experimented with us and everything else. I've taken both of my shots. You hear me? It's called a pandemic, and it's airborne. And this is not the case of them giving you something they ain't giving them. A lot of whites talking about they ain't taking it. These are largely Republicans. They politicized health. Hell, your health comes before anything, later for the politics. So I'm recommending you take your shot. Take it. You don't hear me? Because they've killed we and the Latinos have died more than any other group. We've lost 2% of our life expectancy. They've lost 6% of their life expectancy through this pandemic. And that's because of the structures of institutional racism, but also the way in which Trump handled this. He didn't. That was his decision. But he took his shots. You're just finding out about it, telling everybody else is not serious. So as we explore this notion of God within us, what that means, what it means in terms of our humanity, it's very important to understand why this discussion is essential. Because if we're going to construct something better, we've already constructed a better human being in this country. But if we can make that human being even more better, then the way in which we express our humanism, our love for self, is the key to the way we can change society. Changing society begins with the deepening and strengthening of the essence of what it means to be human, as well as the deepening and strengthening of our identity, which also promotes self-love. So what I want to plunge into now is another view of humanity. And this is both the African and what I call the New African or African American view. And it is also the view that comes from gifted spirit people, people who see things and have gone to this other realm that simply confirms what I'm talking about. Remember, in introducing myself, we haven't used my intro to the show, but I'm a spirit scholar warrior. You're finding out what the spirit part means. And like you, we're all spirits having a human experience. And we all are going through transformation and change. We're having ups and downs in life. And this is the great classroom for us. Spirits in heaven line up to come here to learn lessons. And the main lesson we're trying to learn is to get closer to God, to be more godlike. And we come here with strengths and we come here with weaknesses. And the weaknesses are the path to growth if we learn from them. So what I'm going to be talking about here is powers, particularly one in particular that we have that is really the gateway to God that dwells inside of us. But I'm talking not just about powers, but about potential and about what we can do to move along. And so in our lives, this can help us into negotiating things. And people here, I know, are all different kinds of levels of consciousness, some way beyond mine, you know what I mean? So I'm not here to say, here I am, I've got all the answers. No, I'm just trying to share with you some of your powers. You hear me? And if God dwells within you and me and everybody else, that is a power that is magnificent if we appreciate it and know it for what it is, because then it can help us to be more like that, to draw from that. So I'm going to draw heavily on Kemetic stuff, the Kemite, KMT, meaning black, land of the blacks, the greatest classical civilization in the history of the world, the greatest civilization, none exceed what this civilization created. And according to all observers in the ancient world, it was black, baby. You hear me? And all the Negroes roll out with their tanks, skip gates, standing before the pyramids saying, a few people here were black, but let us go to the black land. You hear me? A few. Herodotus said, for the blacks, the Egyptians were like the Colchins. This is a matter of fact observation. This was after Kemet was no longer fully ruled by blacks, but occupied by blacks. He said, for the Egyptians are like the Colchins. Matter of fact, he said they have black skin and woolly hair. Matter of fact. You hear me? And that was, of course, no big thing. So he had to go on and distinguish the Colchins and the Egyptians from other people by saying, oh, and another thing that really distinguishes them, they practice circumcision. This seemed to be a more practical way to prove that they were Egyptians, because they practiced circumcision. But a matter of fact, they black. What else could they be? Where are they? In Europe? Are they in Asia? You know? So we're going into a deep well right here. Dogon are my first access to African deep thought, along with African American deep thought. But then it's Kemet, it's Yoruba, it's Asante, it's Bambara, it's Igbo, it's a whole lot of others. And I'm always saying, and it's a deep thought of Black folks here. You hear me? The deep thought. I talked about some of those deep thinkers last week. So we have a passage coming out of Medu Neter. Medu Neter means God speaks. Medu Nefer, the speech of human beings that tries to approximate God. So they saw divinity in everything, including in speech. And so in one of the texts, it's called the text of Urk 4, it says, "You wake gladly every day, all afflictions removed." That's a person who's waking up in the morning and is happy about being alive. You hear me? That's what I do every morning. I say, hey, isn't this beautiful? I got a window where I can see the grass, and every now and then a bluebird flying. You know what I mean? I say, hey, this is wonderful. And then he says, you wake up gladly every day, all afflictions removed. You cross eternity and joy in favor of the God which is in you. Now, eternity. This is a view that we are eternal. This body will decay when we die, but our spirit will go on. You hear me? We're eternal. But the key thing he's saying is, you cross eternity in joy in favor of the God which is in you. They're saying God is inside of you. God is inside of me. So this is stating the general Kemetic, African, and African American position. I don't care what your so-called spiritual orientation is. Most Black people in this country also believe God's inside of them. They usually call it the Spirit or the Holy Ghost, but it's God. It's a very different view from the Western view, because in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, it's the only religions on the planet where God is separate from what God creates. But the African who comes into America, into the Caribbean, carried this African view inside, deep inside of him or her, that says God's within you. And that's the main reason why Black Christianity is different from white Christianity. That's a whole nother subject. We're going to get into new African-American culture, which is a subject we neglect. You hear me? And it's the culture of the world, popular culture of the world. So here's the thing. The Africans who were kidnapped and brought into the Americas, including to the United States, carried here this same knowledge that God was inside of us. And we recreated a new African culture, the top of which, the most important principle of which is spirit. New African culture is spirit-based, which means God. Second to that is family. Anytime a Black person is victorious in something, like a slam dunk, what do they say? Praise God and my mama. It's in you. You can't help it. In fact, the closest thing to God in your life is your mama. And then if you had a father like me, your father. I had one heck of a mother. They called her Queen. And she was, of course, a strict disciplinarian. And I had a hell of a father. Kind and gentle to us, but woe to the white man that insulted Black people. He's so light, most of them thought he was white. He had Black features. When they used that N-word, those brass knuckles came out and they were laying on the floor. And then when they woke up, he'd say, I'm one of them, buddy. My father never put a hand on us. We'd be dead if he did. He put kind words on us. He had both the masculine and feminine qualities in him. But when whites saw him, they saw that grim reaper. I have that grim reaper, that me. I don't smile a lot because I got a warrior spirit, but he had the gentle side and he had the warrior side. My mother said when he did something she didn't like, he actually got on his knees and crawled and apologized. I said, really? That's not something I'm doing, you know what I mean? But the fact is, what kind of man is that? That's a hell of a man, meaning a good man, you know? So the soul of African-American people is a spirit. Du Bois called it the souls of Black folks. So we create a culture that has spirit at its top. And then in the midnight of slavery, we create an art form. And the foundation of that art form is the spiritual blues. And I have a piece that I've done on it. It's my best piece. You should check it out. My cinematographer, Lo Rojan, did a lot of beautiful work to it, but it's a heart and soul of the culture because your art form is the highest expression of your culture. And for Black folks in this country, music is at the foundation of the art form. It's the pinnacle of the art form. And one reason drums were outlawed here. So as a result, we went in and relied more on music. In the spiritual blues is contained the deepest core of our philosophy. As I was internalizing these principles you see behind here, represented by the Numo twin, I was internalizing blues thought, spiritual blues thought, as well as other deep African American thought. And so you can't have one without the other. Africa's the root, we're the fruit. Africans anywhere in the world are the fruit. And so when we come into this enslavement in the Caribbean, in South America, in the United States, there's a war that goes on between us and the masters. And the main thing that inspired us was spirit. And it was the spirit that resided inside of the people who were enslaved. They combined that with insurrection, knowledge, and action. And some of the songs they would sing would talk about this spirit. And one of the favorite ones, and in the freedom movement, we used it, it was Fannie Lou Hamer's favorite song. Fannie Lou Hamer was a timekeeper coming out of Ruleville, Mississippi. Timekeeper gave you a little better job than picking cotton. And she was a healing woman. And when she had a singing voice, and when she sang, you could only see the whites of her eyes. She was a spirit woman. And her favorite song was, "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." And in the movement, the Black Freedom Movement, we would sing that in jail. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine all over the jailhouse. I'm gonna let it shine." What's that light? That's the God within you. God is a light. I've seen God, a beautiful light, a magnificent light. We'll talk about that more, but every human being has this light within them. People who are spiritually gifted, who can see spirit. Some people can. What do they see when they see a human being? They see light emanating from them. That's the light of God within you. God put that light in everything God created. But you're a special creation for God because, as I pointed out before last week, talking about the Bambara, you're the one God can communicate with, and you are the one that can communicate with God that should even want to. Birds ain't thinking about communicating with God, but they have a light. And in every creature God has created, that light is intelligence. And if you observe animals in nature, there's a lot you can learn. Most of our inventions come from observing nature and learning from it. So Africans coming in here were spirit people. And we carried that into everything we did. So our natural leaders, because we were not Christians for the most part at that time, they were diviners. They were African priests. And they were there to look out for our future, to help us to negotiate this thing called slavery. W.B. Du Bois described the diviners, or they were called Obeah men or women. He said they were the natural leaders of the people. He said they were the healers of the sick. They were the ones who comforted the sorrowful. He said they were the ones that people went to in times of distress. And you have no rebellion, maybe one or two, but very few, in enslavement that did not have spirit at its core. Good old General Nat Turner was a spirit man. His inspiration to rebel came from dreams that came from within him, from God, the God within. And it told him to shed some blood for freedom. Denmark Bessie's rebellion, which is the best organized of all the rebellions held in the United States and South Carolina. It was led by Denmark Vesey, who used Old Testament teachings to justify the rebellion. But the principal spirit man in his rebellion was a man named Gula Jack, and Gula Jack was an Angola priest. And a good part of the battalions that he had recruited had come straight out of Africa. And then some of them were second generation Africans in this country. And so Gula Jack could convince them that bullets couldn't hurt them. But the main thing he convinced them of, you better not betray this rebellion. That was at the core of resistance of our people. Hush harbors, going in the furthest removed part of a plantation to put your head under a bucket to bring down the spirit, risking whippings. Why? Because that's what kept you going. It enabled you to maintain contact with God. So no rebellion without spirit. And if you look at the Denmark Vesey rebellion, one of the inspirations for it was the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution was inspired by voodoo, the only successful slave rebellion in the history of the world. And we should give every support we can to the people of Haiti. Every administration in this country, the Western world, has ground them into the dust for what? For successfully whipping white people on the battlefield. Under Toussaint, under Dessalines. Dessalines was the baddest. Toussaint was a hell of a general. Dessalines was the baddest. When he got into power, he decreed that if you had a drop of black blood in you, you're black. Don't run around here calling yourself something else. And only blacks could own land in Haiti. But here was a man at the supreme state of power. He at this point commanded the armies of Haiti because Toussaint was put in prison. He made the mistake of trying to negotiate with the French and believing that he could work some deal out with them. So he died in prison. Dessalines is running the country. He's got the army. But because he drew from the vision of Africa, he had a third decree that the land of Haiti should be shared equitably. No one should have more, no one should have less. That spirit inspired blacks in this country to rebel. And in fact, Denmark Vesey told them, strike the first blow and Haiti will support us. So a voodoo-bound people, voodoo just means God, Haiti, which was supportive of freedom movements all over the Western Hemisphere and in the world. That Simon Bolivar, when he goes to him for help, there's one condition. We'll give you guns, but you free your slaves. And free every, throughout the South America. See that happens, because he had a South American-wide movement. So spirit has been at the core of our people. It's at the heart and soul of our culture. And one thing that enabled blacks to endure 249 years of enslavement here, hundreds of years in the Caribbean and South America is that, remember, God is spirit. God is outside of time, outside of space. Heaven, there's no time. And of course, no space and no matter. It's out of the material world. Many Blacks during enslavement lived outside of time, meaning they were in a spirit realm while they were here doing this miserable business. And so don't say, as too many of our people say, they dehumanized us in slavery. How can you say that? Don't confuse dehumanized conditions with being dehumanized. The mantra of African American and generally African cultures around the world is this: we will turn ugliness into beauty. We created a culture and we created an art form to bring beauty where there's ugliness. The most beautiful among our people are often the most materially poor. My wife tells me that in the Caribbean, they have a saying for everyday Black people. They call them poor great, meaning they may be materially poor, but they are great. And great in what? Great in character, great in kindness. It might be rough kindness. We came out of slavery. You had to be tough coming out. You know about those whippings that we need to end. You know about that. I'm not romanticizing this. But that same one that would whip you, fed you, and hugged you, and gave you love. You hear me? The best love they could give. I sometimes call it confused love, but it was love. And in many cases, it was real deep love. You hear me? So the thing is, everyday Black people are the best manifestations of this. And in this country, Southern Blacks exude the highest qualities of these spirit qualities. Yeah, and they've also got the legacy of slavery hanging around. But the fact is, if you want some real kindness, if you want some real hospitality, if you want some real caring and loving, it's nothing better than what you get from Southern Blacks. You know what I mean? And that's in spite of the hell they went through, because it's in us. I always say that when it comes to Black folks, everyday Black folks in general, what is extraordinary for every other people, except maybe Native Americans, is ordinary for us. In fact, it's just ordinary for us to be taking care of family members and not putting them in old folks' homes, even though we're putting more of our people in old folks' homes now. That extraordinariness is ordinary, because being human, being humane, is at the core of our being. And so it's not power that is the most important thing. And don't get me wrong, I know power is important. I'm a warrior. But the fact is, it's how you wield that power. And do you wield it justly or unjustly? And so the ethics are the most important thing. So one of the things about this African, Kemetic, Yoruba, Dogon, New African, African American, African Caribbean culture is that it has also created a people who are spiritually self-reliant, meaning that we know that if we're going to get a passport to certain things in life, we have to earn it. And enslaved Blacks believed that just because they were oppressed did not guarantee their admission to heaven. And by the way, their main concern wasn't heaven. It was heaven on this earth. It was getting some freedom right now. And they also knew that every attempt to escape wasn't guaranteed success. But they knew basically to look after their character. I don't care how wretched the conditions they were in. So quit talking about they dehumanized us. It's the people who enslaved us, these Aryans, who are practicing a dehumanized culture, that were dehumanized before they enslaved us, during, and after. We came out of enslavement with our humanity intact, scarred with issues, all kinds of issues. But the fact is, the living proof that our humanity is intact is that we're here. I don't need to give you no data or nothing, because when we had no land, people in the Caribbean had land. We had none. We had no mules. We had nothing. We just had each other. We took care of each other. And whatever gains we've made in this country, we've made those gains. You get the right to vote. Black people made that. Movement I was in, the San Francisco Freedom Movement, jobs where there were none, the people made that. Our movement made that. And you can't, after you benefit from that, turn your back on your people. But the key thing is, quit running around here talking about they took our culture. They destroyed our humanity. You think you're getting sympathy for that? Only way they take your culture is to wipe you out. The only way a people lose a culture is to cease to exist. As long as you exist, you have culture. It changes. It has to. But it's culture. And through the culture that we created here, recreated, and the art form, our culture is the popular culture of the United States and the world. And that art form is the art form of the United States and the world. And what does it have? Sheer beauty. People can't create that unless they're drawn on something very beautiful inside. Beauty is measured by character. In a past show, I talked about the Yoruba conception of beauty. It's called Ila Iwa. It means essential character is beauty. It really means however you're constructed, that's beautiful. With your strengths and your weaknesses, that's beautiful. A piece of art could be of the most ferocious animal. It's beautiful if you capture its nature. And when you get to the nature of a human being, ultimately, these are the human qualities that are most important. So what I'm dealing with today is self-knowledge is knowing the God within. To say that God is within us is to say that we all have God's light within us. There are a couple of things that really work to block us seeing this. One is ego. The other is fear. The other is false teachings. And there's a lot of other things, but I'll just focus on these three things. De-spiritualization has created in the minds of many a world in which spirit is superstitious, even though everything is spirit. Quantum physics affirms it, everything else affirms it. But if you think it's that way, that's the way it seems to be. So de-spiritualization, when you separate the spirit from the mind, then the ego is in operation. And the ego is all about lower impulses, like greed, like envy, like negativity, like domination. So that's an obstacle. Another obstacle for us seeing the God within us is fear. Now, this one is harder for people to get because this is a companion that a lot of people live with, and they'll even make excuses for it. And they will say that it makes me stronger. They'll say things like, I wouldn't be doing the good I was doing without fear. In other words, you're not doing it because it's right. You're doing it because you're afraid of the consequences, like God's going to send you to hell. I used to have that fear, by the way, fear of the consequence of my own wrongdoing. I've said this before, but I got over that fear because I knew this is false. In that I'm going to have to pay for whatever I do, right or wrong. What's the point of being afraid of it? I didn't have any other fears. The problem with fear and it being a roadblock to seeing the light that is within, or the God that is within, is that fear deprives you of being free, because it freezes you in that moment of fear, and you end up your life constantly reacting to whatever it is you fear. The way in which you were raised, mistreatment that occurred to you, abuse, neglect, a whole lot of things. And so as a result of that, when you're tied to that and you're always going back to that, then it makes it difficult to live in the moment freely, difficult to experience life freely. Babies are not born in fear. Babies are taught fear. One of the biggest sources of fear is this false teaching of fearing God. Now, I know I'm stepping on a lot of toes. Some people don't want to hear this. And in fact, this symbol back here of one God, one interpretation that Christian S.N.C.C, because that's not a Christian symbol, put to it was fear God. And then others say, no, that isn't what it means. Accept God, meaning there's nothing except God. God's unconditional love, among many other things. But that's one of the most important. Unconditional. God's not judgmental. It's like your mother. Good mothers accept their children the way they are. Now, if they see some real problems, they want to do something about it. But God's compact with us is we have to take care of that. We're on this earth to exercise free will. And so our free will, that's what we have to do to take care of this. So if you fear God, you can't love God. And God is unconditional love. This is false teaching. But this is a teaching that keeps you under control. You know what I mean? Keeps you under lockdown. You know what I mean? So fearlessness is a natural state. And fearlessness is freedom. And if you want to fully create, because that's your mission in life, whatever your gifts are, to fully express them, then freedom means freedom from fear. That's a big one. So these are like obstacles. And by the way, my mother, who passed on in 2005 at 90 years of age, real good person, but she had questions about whether there was such a place as heaven. And she lived till 90, and she told me she was living on borrowed time, meaning her will was keeping her alive. She knew that it was really her time to go. And one of the reasons was her fear of what came after death, because all she knew was her body would go on the ground. That was it, you know. After she passed, my sister, who's a very spiritual person, might have her on the show dealing with some stuff at another time. She had contact with my mother. Now you say, oh, contact, yeah, really? Well, the proof of the pie is in the pudding. I was away speaking in South Carolina when she died, and I was the one that had the information for how to take care of her body. She wanted cremation, a place called the Neptune Society. I'm the only one that knew that. And they couldn't find the papers. My sister's driving in the car one day, and my mother speaks to her and says, Neptune Society. Huh? But she also said this. She said, if I knew that heaven was so beautiful, I wouldn't have resisted dying. You know what I mean? Huh. Now, I subscribe to the blues song that says, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. I'm in that category, just like you. You know what I mean? So I'm not looking forward to death, even though I've seen the other side. I know how beautiful it is. I also know how beautiful this place is, and particularly what we have to do. And in my case, I know my mission, so I ain't leaving here, I hope, until I fulfill it. So the Kemites gifted parapsychologists who are gifted spiritual people say some things, and particularly the Kemites say some things that are very important about this notion that God lies within every human being. And so, I want to address this, which is God's presence inside of us on one level, because God is present on many levels. I'm going to talk about just one. It's what the Kemites called Ib. Ib, or Hati, H-A-T-I. It meant heart. And when they portrayed the heart, they portrayed the organ, because the Kemites were master medical people. Imhotep was the father of medicine. They discovered the circulation of blood. They actually went in and examined the organs. They understood the body. And the thing about Kemetic spirit systems is they're both concrete and abstract. In other words, when they deal with the concept, they will give you a picture, and that picture is very concrete. And in this case, Ib, heart, which in their term means heart mind. Now, the Chinese and Japanese also have a term called heart mind. And they were founded by the Ainu, A-I-N-U. They're the first people in Japan. They're the first people in China, and the first people in the Philippines. So it's possible that their use of this term comes from the fact that they were civilized by us. We were the first people in China, first people in Japan. In fact, the Japanese were Black. The Asiatic Japanese that you see come from Korea. And the Filipino, the same thing. Or it may be that they simply have contact with their inner self and have explored this. So for the Kemites, the heart mind is the light within us in which God dwells, or is an expression of God dwelling in us. It is God's light inside of us. Gifted spiritual people who can actually see lights. You have a thing called an aura. It's a light around you. There's a thing called Kirlian photography that actually shows you the picture of your aura. The color of your aura, mine's gold, my mother's was purple, shows your level of consciousness. And by the way, your favorite colors are probably tied to your aura, So there are some people that can actually see your aura. And so with the heart mind, the experience is the best proof of its existence. It is that light that dwells within you. Now, there are, in fact, many elements of this light. I'm talking about only one. God's multifaceted. God's multidimensional. I piped into God's mind. God's mind is whole. You'll never get all of it. If you're getting a part, you'll get the whole to a part. I call it within anything, everything. And you'll never get the everything within anything. For George Washington Carver, that anything was the peanut and a lot of other things. And he got a whole lot out of it, and he couldn't possibly get all of it that's in it. So whereas this despiritualized mind is hierarchical, something on the top, something on the bottom, individual, separate, this God's mind is whole. It's interconnected. And as hard as we may try, we'll never get close to it. But what resides inside of you, your heart mind, is the seat of this. And basically, the meaning of heart mind in Kemet is it's the seat of intellectual consciousness, and it's the seat of morality. It's the seat of feeling. It's the seat of all the traits that make you human, courage and love and all of these things. And the key thing about African thought is this. We understand that wisdom ain't got nothing to do with IQ. Wisdom grows out of goodness. It grows out of truth. It grows out of kindness. It grows out of the fundamental qualities that make a good human being. Because in the end, if you talk about deep thought or philosophy, what is that about? The pursuit of truth. And so heart mind is that place in which dwells both intellectual consciousness and morality. And the path to consciousness is through morality, because it is through high ethics, through high morals. It's through the pursuit of truth that we gain wisdom. Everybody old isn't wise. And so the question is, what do we learn from the trials of life? There's an old saying, a fall in the pit leads to mother wit. Sometimes people have to fall in the pit of life 3 or 4 times. There's a great jazz singer who would sing this song about how she was referring to when she was in LA. She walked down the street, and every time she fell in this hole until finally she got out. That hole was alcoholism, you know, until she finally made up in her mind that she would transcend that hole, rise above that hole. But the seed of all of this, the ability of us to transform and change and grow and everything else, is this heart mind. And in this particular case, the seat of intellectual consciousness and the seat of morality. And in life, our greatest lessons are learned through the crisis of life, those periods in which we're in trouble. That's what usually brings us closest to God. That's why we're here. We're here to get closer to God. We're here to smooth out our rough sides, to work on our weaknesses. That's what we're here for. And we have strengths that help us do that. But at certain periods in life, you will be tried. And while it's woe is me time and why did it happen to me time and all the rest of this, and I know everybody here watching this has had some of this experience, that's what you're here for, more than anything, to learn from it. And I can personally say that the best period in my life was its worst in terms of hardship, spiritual hardship and spiritual crisis. But it was the best because of what I learned from it. And so what lies within the heart mind are powers that help us to negotiate this. It helps us to express our gifts, but overcome our weaknesses. Now, heart mind as intellectual consciousness is described in Kemet as SIA, S-I-A, which means exceptional intellectual clarity. And the Kemites are clear on this. This is where God dwells. In other words, it's God's mind. Now, exceptional intellectual clarity, first of all, arises from moral knowledge and moral practice. And in Kemet, that arises from Ma'at, which is the foundation of Kemetic philosophy, but it's the foundation of African philosophy, period. African mothers teach this. This is the main thing that African mothers, Black mothers teach, and a lot of other mothers. To be a good person, to be truthful, don't lie. Be responsible for what you do. They instill in you discipline so you'll acquire self-discipline. By the way, in life, my belief is that the 2 essentials in life is good character and discipline. Discipline. The Yorubas teach that no matter what your gifts are, if you don't work hard and if you at the same time are not trying to be a good person, we all got problems. We all do wrong things and whatnot. I'm not talking about being perfect, but being the best that we can and being good human beings. That is really the path to to wisdom. In the West, that's not the case. High IQ just means you scored high. What you're going to do with it doesn't matter. Universities don't test you on your character. It's just, did you feed back what the professor gave you? But the classroom of life, and the classroom that we need to recreate in a just society, needs to prepare people to be the truths that we learn, not just to know them, but to be them. I've said this before, to know the truth in African-American culture is to be the truth. And so this knowing, or this moral knowledge of what's right and what's wrong, is inside of us. Because if God's inside of us, then truth is inside of us. Your mother is your main teacher that brings out these truths, that encourages you to cultivate these truths, and is going to get on you when you depart. I don't care what your age is. And for many, your father as well. And so the Kemites had a saying, and I think this is useful for us today, that the way we internalize moral knowledge is through being a hearer who becomes a listener. The purpose of hearing and listening is that so we will know the truth and internalize and act on the truth. And so your mother and father bring this out. Some mothers think that they brought the morals to them. No, human beings are born with this. But the teachings help to cultivate it and to bring it out. The unjust person, the Kemites described as a person whose face is blind to what he should see, deaf to what he should hear, and his heart strays from what he should remember. In other words, truth goes in one ear and out the other. You hear me? He's saying, but he ain't got no intention of really listening and hearing so that he can be what he learns. And the whole process of moral cultivation is a humble process. And the most important thing we can do is listen. Listening is the path to learning. So the heart-mind works the way a gardener does, because in this intellectual and moral development, it's a pruning process. It's a process of uprooting weeds in our character and trying to get our spiritual garden so that it grows right. So the heart mind is both an intellectual and it's a moral teacher. And it's the light of God that is within the human being that enables us to grow. The Kemites had another way of describing a person's good character. They said, and this is when you're grown, good character is replacing your mother at home and your father when he said, note this, son, do this, meaning you're grown, but your mother and father's teachings are with you. And it's always keeping them present, because those two beings have the most concern for your well-being, assuming you have good parents. And in most cases we do, sometimes we don't. But if we do, draw from those teachings. And there's a Kemetic and an African saying in general, when you're alone, realize that you can be seen, meaning the spirit world is watching you. There's no such thing as hiding anything in the spirit world. So good character that grows out of the heart mind that is both intellectual and moral, and morality leading to wisdom, creates nobility. It creates a noble person because they are drawing from the truths that are inside of them. And it can lead to incorruptible character. Dizzy Gillespie said his two favorite people were Paul Robeson and Malcolm X. And he said, because they had incorruptible character. If we can come through life saying that, through all the mud that we deal with in life, all the corruption that's around us, that if whatever our shortcomings are, if we can hold on to this incorruptibility, that is a major achievement. Malcolm had his weaknesses, Paul Robeson did, and a whole bunch of other Black people and people of color and human beings, period, do. But if they hold on to that, that's one of the things closest to God. The Yorubas' definition of God is the one with superlative character. This means character without blemish, character without wrongdoing. In the West, the emphasis is always on the power of God. But in Africa, among Black people, many here, the most important thing is the goodness of God, the truthfulness of God. And that's what you have dwelling inside of you. And so the question is, what do we do with that? Where do we go with that? So character is beautiful because in all the choices we make in our life, the sum total of them, when the positive outweighs the negative, now this is being practical. When that happens, it means that you have a beautiful character. It would be wonderful if we could say, when we make all the right decisions in life, when we do everything right, hey, then we're getting to heaven. No, then ain't too many of us going. It's the weighing of positive against negative, and that the positive outweighs the negative. And it's the smile you put on other people's faces that help lift them up. The Kemites had a saying that when they talked about good people, they would say, I gave a boat to the boatless, food to the hungry, and clothes to those whose clothes were tattered. In other words, good character comes through good practice. And the good practice is serving humanity. So the light of God that is within us is the light of morality, because God is good, God is just. And someone who is enlightened is not someone full of facts. It's someone full of light, someone who has insight. There's an old brother in Tanzania, he's from here, we called him Mzee Robeson. This was in the 70s. And he said, talk to an educated person and he'll quote somebody, but talk to a wise person and he'll give you his opinion. That's what wisdom is, you know? That's what the joy of life is. John Coltrane said that he could learn music from the worst musicians because there was something they could do that he couldn't do. That's humility, you know? The Kemites had a saying that you will find wisdom even in the marketplace, among the market women. I would say that's where you will often find it, you know? And so this wisdom is tied to truth. This wisdom is tied to justice. But here's the key point. This is the real key point. Get this one. The heart mind is not just the seat of intellectual consciousness derived from pursuing the truth, speaking it, and living it. The Kemites said the heart mind is the seat of Sia, S-I-A, and Sia means exceptional intellectual clarity, because you're drawing from the mind of God. Now, most of us have been trained if we've gone through higher education in the white boy's mind. So that mind is mind minus spirit. And even though we study Kemet and we can quote everything, that is what we usually use to translate the meaning of Sia. For many, it means, intelligence. It means intellectual knowledge. But it said exceptional intellectual clarity. Exceptional. The first one is reason minus intuition. And so we know a lot. We get good grades. For those that went to school, they got degrees. But how many degrees of wisdom do they have? So reason minus intuition does not lead to exceptional intellectual clarity. It leads to theories. Theories are guesses. They're ideas that are half right, half wrong, but not exceptional. And every now and then it might be exceptional, and you might have some exceptional insight, but within it, there's also going to be error. And of course, the greed and everything else that goes along with it. But this exceptional intellectual clarity is of a different order. And so when the Kemites say heart, mind is in the heart, we often call it the gut. That's your intuition. That's that thing inside of you that when it tells you something, it doesn't lead you wrong. That's the guide. That's the God inside of you. We all have this experience. And when we go against it, we regret it. I'll give 2 examples from my experience. One was when I was teaching at Martin Luther King Junior High School in Sausalito, California, one of the richest districts in the United States. My spiritual mother, Ray Richardson, had got me this job. I just married, so they knew I needed a job, blah, blah. So I've been working free nearly 10 years. So I was teaching. And junior high school, had a little kid in the class who was a Panther, and a guy named Welvin Stroud was principal, and he was a leader in the Black Panther Party, So I enjoyed it. Though it really wasn't what I was suited for. I didn't know that at that time, but I enjoyed it. And so at the end of the year, the superintendent is going to give me a provisional credential, teaching credential. And because I didn't have one, so I want to continue to teach. The FBI ran a COINTELPRO on me, counterintelligence program. They had already tried to kill me a couple of times, And so a 17-page report saying this man's a criminal. You can't give him this job. Well, that was a part of COINTELPRO, keeping radicals out of the classroom because they didn't want you radicalizing students. And definitely what I was doing, you know what I mean? So I understand your position. And they said, well, he's been arrested 17 times. It was wrong. It was actually 18. 16 in San Francisco Freedom Movement, 1 as a marshal in King's Selma to Montgomery March. I was arrested there. And 1 in Mississippi. That's a place you do not want to be arrested. That's a whole nother story I'm not going into now. And so that was their basis. So I'm a strategist, I'm a fighter, and I knew I could beat this. So I'm driving to Sacramento to see a guy named Nate Miley, who was a crack NAACP lawyer. He won cases like this. He didn't have one like this. COINTELPRO was the same thing. He'd win, easy. Halfway to Sacramento, this heart mind, it doesn't talk. You just feel it, at least with me. I just feel it. It said no. In effect, it was telling me to turn around, Now, when the heart mind speaks at this level, you don't know why. It's not giving you the reason, kind of like what your mother does when she's telling you to do something. You're asking for the reason. She said, boy, do it or else you're going to get a reason. It's one you're not going to like. And so I turned around, I usually listen to this, not always, but usually. And so what did that mean? 3 years, this was 1969. 3 years later, I'm having meetings at our Pan-African People's Organization, a group I formed after the Civil Rights Group, C.O.R.E. We're having meetings every Sunday, hundreds of people coming and raising consciousness and organizing. So in comes a guy named Nchisani. Nchisani is a South African. He's acting chair of Black Studies at San Francisco State, but he's really working for a sister named S.N.C.C Caillou and Ray Richardson. They're really running it, you know, Queen Mothers. And they told him what to do. Offer me a job. I never thought of teaching in a university. Never thought of teaching. The only thing I knew was I'm going to be a fighter. Dropped out of law school. I didn't want to be a lawyer because I figured white jury, white judge, you know what I mean? I can beat them in the streets. Better occupation. How you make money doing that's another story. But the point is, that's what I had thought. So 40 years of teaching at San Francisco State. One reason is God was telling me that when it said, don't go to that lawyer, God knew what was going to happen 3 years later. I'm going to give you another example. This was 1987. I'm at San Francisco State and I was in a graduate program, you know, PhD. I got it late. I was already tenured, didn't need one. It was just an experience I wanted to challenge. So I got a meeting at 4 in the afternoon. And I got to go across the Bay Bridge, the Dumbarton and whatnot, to get to this meeting. And the spirit tells me, again, it's a feeling, leave right now. You know, so I say to myself, leave right now. I'm going to be in this room waiting for this guy for 3 hours. What is this? So I didn't leave in the first hour. And then I said, this spirit never leads me wrong. I left. There was no fear, no nothing. I didn't know why I was leaving. Turns out that had I left on time, I would have been close to where the Bay Bridge opened up and close to where the Dumbarton collapsed on people. You hear me? C.O.R.E, exceptional intellectual clarity, which is the clarity of God that's within you, sees ahead and sees behind. And so when it's advising you, you often don't know why. But when it comes from here, you know it never leads you wrong. So heart mind is that. And what's interesting is with heart mind, we about the only people, because I a lot of Black people, a lot of people who told me, well, God didn't tell me nothing. You know what I mean? I didn't hear nothing. That's because your spirit's been talking to you. This heart mind, this C.O.R.E has been talking to you and you ain't been listening. And so it's kind of shut off. You remember that thing about listening? Listening isn't just the path to morality coming from your mother. Listening isn't just the path coming from your teacher. Listening is what comes from God. Listen, because we all got this spirit inside of us that looks out for us. This God inside of us is your companion. It's your lookout sentinel. When there's trouble, it's going to warn you. You're going to feel it. You often can feel it. You don't feel right. You know what I mean? That's telling you something. Get out of there. Or you're around certain people. Your dog is growling because that dog has got the spirit of God inside of it. And they know this is a no good for nothing sucker, but you're saying, oh, quiet, Fido, be quiet. The dog's trying to protect you. You know what I mean? Because sometimes the dog got more sense than us. And notice, before an earthquake, the birds, all of the creeping, crawling critters know something. And they all take measures. So C.O.R.E, exceptional intellectual clarity. But I want to give you the final meaning for this because, and this comes from experience. It's not just intellectual clarity. It's exceptional. It's clarity without error. It's truth without blemish. in my own case, my greatest experience of SIA, and I want to share this with you because this is the most beautiful, transformative experience of my life. This book that I showed you last week, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is the most important thing I've done in my life. This. Because it comes from SIA. And in my case, the experience that I underwent to gain this exceptional intellectual clarity came from me addressing the central issue in my life, which I did not realize would be the central issue until I was faced with it. And that central issue had to deal with my relationship, my first wife, a good woman. And as long as she was alive, I never said this, I've mentioned this a few times before. After 17 years of marriage, I discovered that she was delusional. She had a mental illness disorder that she never recognized. Most people who are delusional, once they go to a psychiatrist or psychologist, they realize, oh, I'm delusional. I'm going to take some medication. That's about all that psychologists can do, along with give you some advice how to act normal. But you still got delusion inside of you. So you think things are happening that aren't happening. And her change of life brought this on, but it was always there. So I've been married to her actually 17 years and had not seen it. And I never really dealt with mental illness before. Didn't know how to handle it. I went to a friend of mine, G2 and G2 said, get her to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I sent her, and I went with her to Nathan Hare, to Richard King. One's a psychologist, one's a psychiatrist. They didn't do any good for her, not because they're not good. She needed a woman, and she finally found one. But I realized I had a problem. I mentioned some of this before, but what I haven't told you is what the experience was. I had a problem. My problem was I didn't see it. And I'm an astrologer, I already knew, and I knew from my own personal makeup, I was good with the masculine, but not so good with the feminine. I knew that, Tough and rough, good at it. I was always been a kind person, but I had an exterior that you wouldn't know it. That's a part of what warriors do, you know what I mean? The mean machine and all this stuff, And so I went on these retreats for 5 years, 3 months every year, 15 months of looking at myself, mainly looking at the feminine side of my nature, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mother, the influences that they've had on me, and looking at how the feminine worked and didn't work with me. One good friend that I have, she made an observation because she observed that after I went through this transformation, she said, before it was hard to approach you, now you're approachable. She says, I feel like I can talk to you. And then she paid a big compliment. She said, like Asa Hilliard, because Asa was, for those of you who don't know it, a very spiritual Black man, beautiful Black man, very kind, soft, beautiful, So the point is, I went through this introspection and I was in a period of crisis. I was dealing with both my mother, with my wife. I was dealing with the fact that I had to be chair of Black Studies and didn't want to. I enjoyed teaching and organizing. I didn't want to be an administrator. And then some other things came up that were financial, that I got some people into something and I owed them money. I didn't, but I guaranteed an investment theme that didn't work. So I had to pay that back. So, and then my sister sends her troubled daughter to stay with us for 6 years. So usually when you have a crisis, it's one thing piling on top of the other. And there's the old saying that no matter how hard things are, God's equipped you so you can handle it, but you wonder And so this was the crisis. So it was these years of cultivating this inner side of me, this feminine side of me, this sensitivity, working on it. And I camp out for those 3 months, sometimes stay in a cabin, but usually camp out under the stars. It was peaceful. So it's after this experience that I experienced the most beautiful experience of my life. Well, I underwent awakening in sixfold stages, awakened to being an African. That was a transformative experience for me. It prepared me for this. Without this Dogon philosophy, other African philosophies, without African-American deep thought, I wouldn't have had the models for understanding this. I wouldn't have understood, for example, the Dogon teaching that perfection in a human being is a synthesis of masculine and feminine qualities. That's perfection, balance. But I had the model, and my thought patterns were changing over years to prepare me for this. And so it's after this transformation of 5 years that I began to write the Mother Principle. And that's when this book is about just societies. And so what's the basis of just societies? I didn't want a factual book that just had facts and dates and stuff. No, I wanted an understanding of the models for just societies. And so it's when I asked the question, what was the model for just societies? I had the most beautiful experience of my life, and this is C.O.R.E. For different people, the experience of this level of exceptional intellectual clarity is different. So it could come in different ways. Mine has come through the light, the beautiful light, a great white light. As I've told you before, the great holy man of the Lakota people, the Native Americans, Europeans call him Sioux. He's considered the greatest of the holy men, lived to about 98 years of age. He's traveled, his spirit has traveled to heaven and left his body for a long time, 2 and 3 days. I mean, most people, that's death, you know. But he was gone a long time. And in heaven, you can learn a lot in milliseconds because outside of space, outside of time. So he was going there to be trained in his healing gifts. So that was the way in which he communicated with God. But he saw God in the highest heaven because there are realms of heaven. And it was a bright white light. And other spirits in the highest heaven were merging in and out of that light. And it was with these spirits. And he talked about how Mother Earth, the spirit of Mother Earth was there, and it was green. And he was talking about the different great spirits that are with God, but are also the spirits that nourish us here on earth. So this light I saw was the God within us, but it was a great light. And without talking, they gave me the formula for just societies, and I'll give it to you, where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. And that was not no wishful thinking, because God talks to you on your level. Like a good speaker, they get you at your level. He hit me at my level. I knew immediately he was telling me about the Twa, the world's first people. Their societies were organized that way. And so that was transformative. And the key thing about this is this light experience, this exceptional intellectual clarity that came from a formula for just societies. That's why this light was so big, because this isn't just good for Black people, it's good for everybody. Societies where men don't oppress women and women don't oppress men, that's society. Because one doesn't have no more power than the other, but also because of the cultivation of higher powers within them. And so C.O.R.E, exceptional intellectual clarity, it was the revelation of that truth. But then the Kemites say C.O.R.E leads to who? H-U. It means articulate command. When you have received this light of wisdom, it changes your speech because you're aligned with the truth. And then it changes your actions to what's called Heka, which means extraordinary power. When you're in line with the light, your mind, your speech, and your actions are powerful and brings beauty to the world because of the truths that they exude. After this experience, people told me things like spiritual people. You look like you've been touched. Yeah. In fact, my colleagues at San Francisco State were worried because they always saw this fearsome warrior, this kick behind, the president was afraid of me, blah, blah. They thought I was going to become too soft and too weak. You know what I mean? Nah, I'm a warrior. You know what I mean? But I was becoming more balanced. C.O.R.E. So exceptional intellectual clarity of this type requires trials and tribulations and work on yourself. You know what I mean? And so it was the roughest of times for me. My nervous system was almost collapsing, but the results, the best of times. John Coltrane, one of the greatest musicians we've ever had. Coltrane was an average musician most of his time. I've studied him. The book I'm writing on 7 now, The Light That Is Within. Most musicians say he was ordinary, nothing extraordinary about him. His music teacher said, Miss Oakley, he had one gift. It was rhythm. He had a natural sense of rhythm. But other than that, he was ordinary. But he spent 14 hours a day practicing. But then his life crisis was, and one of the reasons it took him so long to get his sound, which is his unique improvisational sound, and then to become an innovator, which very few achieved that. One of the reasons is the talent level wasn't that great, so he had to build it. But the other reason was he lacked self-confidence. And so even when he was ascending, he was always doubting himself. So it took him longer to get to this level where he could express his own sound, improvisation, and come up with new schools of music, 4 of them, which is about as high as the greatest innovators have gone, from ordinary to extraordinary. But he had to negotiate a life crisis. And what was that? Drug addiction and alcohol. And of course, our musicians are surrounded with this. The younger musicians now don't have so much trouble with this as the older ones did before. They're usually playing in crime syndicate clubs and drugs are all over the place. Some of them are very young and they don't have the guidance, but also there's the doubts within. And alcohol, in my understanding, has got to do with some inadequacies that you have inside yourself. My father drank a lot. He lived to only 78 years of age. He could have lived longer. He was functional alcoholic. I didn't know it until he was almost dead. But a lot of that came from rage, understandable. He had fire in his belly, as my cousin David, who also had that same problem and got over it, said. And as he later said, righteous fire in his belly. But that had an effect on him, you know. Coltrane's, part of it had to do with doubts about himself and other issues that I'm not sure of, only he knew. His life crisis came when he could no longer play, when that juice got to be so bad, the drugs and alcohol, that it messed up his playing. So Miles kicked him out of his band. And eventually musicians just started telling him, man, you're John Coltrane. Why are you behaving like this? So he had the courage to face this. Usually, you know, with alcohol, it takes a crisis. That crisis is either death, the loss of a job, or the loss of respective family members. It's one of those or something else. And so he could no longer play his music. He decided to cold turkey, the hardest way to go. Locked himself up in a room until he got all that poison out of his system. But then 2 weeks later, he sits up in his bed and his first wife, Naima, she says, "John, you look different. What's happened?" He said, "I heard a sound from heaven." He said it was a droning sound. Droning is a sound that comes out of India, you know? And so that sound became like that all-encompassing feeling that he had that led him under Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk to find his voice and then later to ascend 4 new schools of music. But it was a reflection of his transformation. It was Sia at the highest level because Coltrane, unlike a lot of musicians, because of the influences of this society, the oppression of this society, always maintained his goodness. Even when he was on drugs, he never stole, he never lied. They called him sweetness. He had beautiful character. So he was the real model of not only Sia, but of Ma'at. He come out of Southern Black culture, So Sia is that exceptional intellectual knowledge or wisdom that is the God within you, but you have to ascend to it. It doesn't just come. And it comes for different people in different ways. George Washington Carver had Sia experiences constantly. And that's why he was the best scientist in the world. He had the gift of botany, healing plants, and then good intellectual training that he would have been the best without, but better with it. But because he was open to God all the time, he was coming up with inventions like the world has never seen before. His Sodaya, which in the Dogon system is the clear word, it's the 4th level of knowledge. In the African-American system, it's innovation. It's creating new schools of thought. He created so many in science, you can't count them, and none of them harmful to humanity or to nature. So talking about, and I'm wrapping up here, self-knowledge is knowing God within, and it is trying to be, as much as you can, that God within. And so Sia is one of those qualities. It takes us away from this de-spiritualized realm. It takes us away from the greedy. It takes us away from the hate. It takes us away from the ego. One of the reasons why George Washington Carver could create so much is that he was humble. He was always open. And that's key. And that was also why Coltrane, even when he was an ordinary player, could ascend. He was always open. He was always listening. He was always learning. He was not like the ones described in Medu Neter, who see but don't really see. Something goes in their ear and out the other, but don't really hear. He was always learning. So as I conclude, I just want to say a few things about models for just societies without going into them. I just want to hit the top. So we have a science that is despiritualized and it is destroying nature. It's bringing the ozone. It's opening up the ozone. It's creating a situation of global warming. It's creating a planet that will be uninhabitable by the end of this century. I would take George Washington Carver, and there are many of him and her in Africa, in the rainforests of South America, and various places where people don't separate spirit from science, but this is the one that has taken it to its highest level. We need, instead of a despiritualized war on nature science, we need a cosmic science, a spirit science, a science that is about healing, is about restoring balance to nature. But for that to happen, there has to be a transformation of the person. That scientist has to draw from that spirit that dwells within him or her. It's not just a matter of quick fixes. Yeah, we got to cut all of the fossil fuel emission and stuff, eliminate it if we can. Yeah, we need to go to wind and solar. But it's not just the quick fix stuff. It's the stuff that's inside of us. If we're in harmony with this nature that we're a part of, then that's the greatest healing of nature. We need a cosmic philosophy, spirit-based, in place of this de-spiritualized one. That's what African philosophies, Native American philosophies are, and early Chinese philosophy was. In other words, the deep thought has to be grounded in the spirit and the light of God. In the end, just societies are going to be based on just people. And while it'd be very hard to get us all just, all harmonious, all balanced, we're in unbalanced circumstances. I get it. But the point is, you can't change society if you don't change yourself. The just society begins with the just person. And we should have learned enough about what's gone wrong with what they call revolutions in the 20th century to understand that it's not the theory that's going to change things. It's the people, and it's the quality of the people. This man on the other side with sunglasses, Amilcar Cabral, was a good model of that. So I just want to say that I hope you got something out of this. Spirit is like your essence. Spirit is like the essence of your soul. Spirit is the essence of your being, combined with your identity, which gives you a sense of purpose and direction. As Black people, as African people, these are two things that will take you forward. Hotep. I see that there's a number of questions here. So one of them here is one question they are saying here, they are operating under emergency authority and the vac has not been approved. Therefore, anyone volunteering to take it is a lab rat. The experiment ends in January 2023. Please see the Lat American Vagabond. So this is somebody that thinks that we shouldn't be taking the shots. See, here's another one. But our culture was also infected with European culture. We can't ignore that. We have been taught to think like our enemies. That is why everyone, everywhere we are, is a mess. Yes, it has been. It has been infected by Eurocentrism. But the core of the culture is what will strengthen us. And our culture has great range. And so there's the extreme where you have people who have been really infected by this. And there are extremes where people are pretty whole. Ella Baker comes out of the extreme where we're pretty whole. So it depends. But yes, it's a part of what we have to work on. The negatives that have come through slavery, we have to work them out. But we have a core culture that we've created. We haven't bothered to study it. So we need to know it, to know ourselves. One question coming from Tito District is, what is the difference between religion and spirituality? Religion is, in the case of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, It's a doctrine usually put in a book. Religion comes from the term religio. Religio means binding together Christianity with what they call paganism, or beliefs that people had before they were Christians. They could be spiritual beliefs. Spiritual beliefs, on the other hand, are those things that come from the light that is within you. We are spirits having a physical experience. So it means drawing from those truths that are inside of you, the light that is inside of you. Religion usually has rules. Spirituality usually doesn't have commandments or issue rules. Spirituality has got to do with drawing from the truths that are inside of you. So we have the 10 Commandments in Christianity, which are good. They draw from the 42 Confessions of Innocence. So they both teach some similar things, and then 32 more in the Kemetic one. But the Kemetic ones are not laws. All the Kemetic ones say is speak truth, do truth, and that should be sufficient. That requires that we know the truth. I mean, that's the key thing for that. See if there are any others. Someone here, Tito, says, yes, racism predates capitalism. That's a point that must be enunciated. Yeah, that's true. Here's one. Baba, did our ancestors understand the God within? If yes, how did they fall? Well, I've just given you some deep ancestral knowledge. Falling, nations rise and fall. So I'm a historian, so I put my historian hat on here. Nations rise and fall. And there are concrete reasons for the rise, concrete reason for the fall, and it's different for different people. So it's kind of like life is slow dying. You're going to eventually die. Does it mean you failed? No, it's a natural process. Rise and fall of civilization is natural. However, when you have forces intervening, as intervene with us, then you have to look at the forces that caused that. And I would say that the biggest force that weakened us in our fall was, of course, division, because the European has used division wherever he's gone, but technology, techniques, gunpowder. As one king said, it's not the one who has the gun, it's the one that makes the powder. And so techniques became a major weapon that Europeans could use. And so that means that we need to master that technology. But in mastering the technology, we don't want to confuse those things that we bring in with the people who brought it in. We don't want to confuse whatever we need that we call modernization with Europeanization. There's one here from Ngoni Awa Hank. Ngoni Awa Hank Aaron recommended 2. He died. And why do you think these devils are trying to help humanity now? It's a pandemic for proof. See event 201 and YT. Pandemic means a global viral, pandemic. It's global. And normally the cure for that is some kind of injection that will cure that. So we've had these pandemics before. And so I understand people's concern. But as long as we have a group of infected people around, since this is spread by air, and I do believe that it did come from bats, I do believe that. I think there's enough evidence. Bats are the main spreader of these kinds of viruses. And so what's key is if we're being operated on, so are white people. Everybody needs to take these injections. And in fact, people in the world who have done the best on this have been the ones that have taken the best measures. And almost all of these are in Asia and in the Caribbean and some parts of Africa. This is from Chief Amen Israel Grand Rising. It's great to hear my former professor. We do need to define our definition of humanism because mankind has a different philosophy. I would say Aryan mankind in particular. Yes, and I agree. And the definition of what it is to be human is complex. The human being is complex. I'm not claiming to give you all of it. I'm just focusing on a little bit. Let's see what else we have here. Well, I guess that's it. So I want to thank you. I hope you got something out of this. Let me know. And by the way, hit the subscriber button on this YouTube and Facebook. Subscription is everything. It gives me stronger algorithms that will enable me to do more. So I want to say it's been a pleasure. I hope people get something out of this. Hotep.